Welcome to Seniority Authority, the podcast where I track down experts to answer your questions on aging. I'm your host, Kathleen Toomey. Let's get smarter about growing older. By now, those who listen to Seniority Authority know that our mission is to get smarter about growing older. But there's so much news out there about new advances in aging. How can we stay on top of all the innovations? Simple. Read Paula Span. Paula Span is the veteran journalist and author who writes 2 columns for the New York Times, The New Old Age and Generation Grandparent. She's on top of the trends, the controversies, and digs into the stories that affect this population. Paula Span is a former Washington Post reporter and teaches at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Her work has appeared at the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Enquirer, New York Magazine, Washingtonian, Glamour, Esquire, USA Today, and numerous other publications. She's the author of the new Audible book, The Bubbe Diaries, as well as When the Time Comes. Families with aging parents share their struggles and solutions, published by Hachette. Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of nonprofit retirement communities, where active adults find community, purpose, and peace of mind. Visit riverwoodsgroup.org. Now, let's hear from today's guest. Paula, it is a true honor to have you on Seniority Authority. Thank you for being on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to join you.
As a well-regarded journalist, you have a lot of options to what you choose to focus on. And today you are covering aging adults, which is a huge demographic shift in the U.S., and the topic of grandparenting. What first inspired you to focus on aging adults?
At the Washington Post, I had begun to do some magazine stories about retirement. There was one about assisted living. In the 90s, we were all wondering, what are these buildings going up around the interstate exits? And they all have garden in the title. I was starting to look into it, but also I was in my 50s, and that's the age when the people that you meet at the grocery store or just anywhere who used to all talk to you about their kids are suddenly all talking about their parents. I mean, I was just seeing it in my circles, in my family, this idea that aging affects virtually every family eventually. I began to want to find out more about it.
That's interesting. It's actually why I started this podcast, because of cocktail parties. Pre-COVID, my friends started coming up to me and saying, hey, you work in retirement. What is assisted living and what's a good place? Or, how do I know the difference between dementia and typical age-related memory loss? And so I, too, started realizing that people have a lot of questions and they're trying to help. And this is a whole new raft of questions, just like they have a whole new raft of questions when they're new parents. But you started when you're in your 50s. So that was kind of an early focus on this demographic shift. You have access to all the greatest thinkers and researchers in the country who are working on aspects of aging. And you write extensively for them in the New York Times. What 1 or 2 advances of all the conversations that you've had have impressed you the most this past year?
Well, not only in this past year, but in the past few years, one thing that sticks with me is actually might not sound like much of an advance. It's the understanding that older adults, because I'm 72, we do genuinely have a number of health issues to deal with. And we all have health care pretty much. We are the only group that comes anywhere close to universal health care through Medicare. We have a tendency to spend a lot of time at doctors, to take a lot of prescription drugs. And I've been interested in this movement called de-prescribing, and also in the work of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which points out as a group, we may be having too many tests and taking too many drugs, in part because our medical system is so fragmented and many of us have many specialists. We have cardiologists and endocrinologists and primary care doctors and maybe oncologists. They don't necessarily talk to each other. And so there are geriatricians, a group that I esteem very highly, doctors who specialize in aging. There are geriatricians who are sounding the alarm on this and reminding us to look at all the drugs we take, including supplements, including aspirin, and talk to doctors about, do we need all of these? Are we duplicating things because we're taking a generic and a name brand? Was there a drug started when we were in the hospital and then no one ever told us when to stop it? And just the idea of filling a paper bag with everything you take and taking it to a doctor and saying, do I need all of these? Should I be renewing them all just month after month? And similarly, on one hand, there are people who don't get colonoscopies, and they should. And then there are others who are getting them way too often. We're getting mammograms way past the point that there's any proven benefit. I just think we have to be smarter about all the healthcare that's available to us. Just because it's there doesn't mean we have to do it.
I think I could not agree with you more. And I think it takes up more and more of older adults' time. And there's legitimate issues. And we're very lucky that we live in a country with many different specialists. But we can get into taking too many tests, taking too many medications. And I would love to see doctors first say, here's what you can do from a lifestyle standpoint that will help your condition. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't work, there's this medication, because I think it's too easy to take a pill. And I myself have an 89-year-old dad who wants a pill to solve his problems, and he doesn't want to drink 8 glasses of water a day or 5 glasses of water a day. And at some point, what you do with your lifestyle can make such a big difference. But traditionally, we have such high regard for medicine that we go to the medicine first, when that's not necessarily the answer. And then there's the whole adage of, if exercise were a prescription, every doctor would write it.
Right.
So I completely agree with you. Can you tell me again, you mentioned the U.S. Protective Services. What is that?
Right. It's the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force.
Okay.
It's been around since the 80s. It's an independent body. It sounds like a government agency, but it's not. It's an independent body of experts whose job it is to review all of the voluminous evidence about prevention, which it is a great thing to have, because it's very hard for a layperson to be reading through all these medical journals and saying, how often should I have a mammogram? Or should I be taking aspirin? That's one of their latest guidelines. So the task force, which is not funded by pharma, it's an independent group, every so often looks at the evidence and says, here's what we think people should do, depending on their age and their condition, about certain preventions. How often do you need a colonoscopy? Should everybody get a bone density scan? Does aspirin really provide a benefit in terms of heart health? Answer, if you are taking aspirin for, quote, primary prevention, unquote, meaning you've never had a heart attack or a stroke or a procedure, but you're taking a low-dose aspirin because a doctor told you to, or because you knew other people were, to try to prevent a heart attack or stroke, you do not need to do that. So I find them very useful. But of course, as evidence accumulates and shifts, their recommendations will change. And sometimes people get mad about that. Well, you just told me I should take an aspirin. Now you're saying I shouldn't. Get it right. Well, this is how science works. You learn more and you change your advice.
Absolutely. And I'm going to put the link to that in our show notes so that everyone can check it out. Right now, because we're living longer, there's a focus on what we can change or alter in our lifestyle that will improve the quality of our longer life. Can you share what you've learned with our listeners about what they can do, what everyone listening now can do to positively affect their own aging process?
Well, there are a few things, and they're not expensive. One you mentioned is exercise. Every study shows that when you start exercising, all kinds of things happen to your cardiovascular system, to your mood, to your depression, to your breathing. You're right. If it was a drug, we'd all want it. And you don't have to be running marathons. You can be walking around your neighborhood. It doesn't matter if you've been sedentary for years. You probably want to talk to a doctor or physical therapist and start slowly and gradually. It helps to do it with a friend or a neighbor, because then you're accountable and you wake up and say, do I want to do this today? Do I want to walk today? I just finished walking with my friend. If someone is waiting for you at the corner, you go. So that's one of the simplest and most effective things that anybody at any age can do, but especially older people. Increases your bone density, just is valuable in every way. It's hard to get people to do it, but it's right at the top of the list. The other things have to do with things that are less easily measured, but I've been real interested in the research on purpose. Purpose, we understand it intuitively. It just means, what's the reason you get up in the morning? All this care you're taking to stay healthy and well and active. What do you do with it? And everybody needs it at any age, but there's been a lot of research with older people. And it also, if you have a strong sense of purpose, which can be measured, social scientists have questionnaires and instruments to measure who has a high sense of purpose and who doesn't. And if you have one, then all other kinds of things happen, from better sleep to less anxiety and depression, better health on a variety of measurements, less dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So finding a way to feel useful and to feel like your life has meaning and direction, which can be any kind of thing. People find it in work. They don't necessarily want to retire, or they don't want to fully retire, or they retire and decide they don't like it. That's called unretirement. And so they find another job, or they express themselves through creative pursuits. They're painting, they're singing, or they're volunteering and helping other people, or they're helping to care for their families, which includes both their elders, because it's not at all unusual for someone in their 70s to be taking care of someone in their 90s, or with their grandchildren and their children, because young families are under a lot of stress, even before COVID, but especially now. And so a lot of grandparents are pitching in more than ever. It's called intensive grandparenting. Now, finding purpose helps keep us well. And the third thing is, I think we could talk a little about ageism.
Absolutely. Ageism
is a term coined by Dr. Robert Butler about 50 years ago. He was the first director of the National Institute on Aging and a gerontologist and physician who coined this term to talk about prejudice, bigotry, discrimination against people based on age, in the same way we think of sexism and racism. It is a form of bigotry, but it's one that we're almost all infected with because we grow up with it. By the time you're a toddler, social scientists can detect ageism.
Really? That's incredible. I hadn't heard that.
Well, think about the fairy tales about the wicked old witch, about the wicked young witch. We all have this, and especially as we grow older ourselves, there can be this kind of frantic desire to be younger, to look younger, to pretend it's not happening. And it's literally dangerous. I'm referring here to work by a pioneering researcher at Yale University. Her name is Dr. Becca Levy. Her new book, by the way, is called Breaking the Age Code, who has measured positive and negative attitudes about aging in older people themselves, because like lots of forms of bigotry, its victims can internalize these attitudes. So if you have more positive attitudes about aging, which is not just sort of a cheerful optimism, but you internally see aging as a time of change and growth and life and activity and inclusion, versus negative attitudes, a time of being dismissed, of being grumpy and helpless and no longer of use. People with positive attitudes about aging just do well on a whole array of tests: physical function, ability to recover from disability, mental health, less depression and anxiety, less dementia, and people with negative attitudes do demonstrably worse. So there are things we can do for ourselves, including thinking about age itself, making it's a time of life that is not necessarily about loss, even though there are losses, and heartache, even though we have that too. But a time like any phase of life, which is 20 years for most of us now, that's the average lifespan of an American who turns 65. 20 years at any point in your life is going to have gains and losses and joys and triumphs and heartaches. And to see age as a time of growth and change and a phase of life that has ups and downs like any phase, and not merely as a series of problems to be solved, health problems and other problems, has real impact on us and on the society in general.
Amen. I could not agree with you more. It is insidious what we tell ourselves and what our mind does to our body. And Dr. Herbert Benson and the whole mind-body connection, what we think does have an impact on how we live. And it is hard enough in a society where once you're 40, all the birthday cards are doom and gloom and over the hill. And that is as unrealistic and as outdated a concept as 8-track tapes. I mean, 40 is not over the hill. It's not even halfway there because
They're actually insulting those cards. I invite your listeners to go to your pharmacy or gift shop and look at the birthday cards for people over 40. It's horrifying, but it will take time for us to come to terms with this. We all feel this way. Even the compliments we pay each other. I'm 60. Oh, you don't look it. Well, what if I did? Like, is it so bad to look 60? You don't act your age. No, I do act my age. This is what 72 is like if you're lucky and healthy.
I'm so glad you bring that up because I think there are two opposing points of view. One is if you're 60, you're decrepit and purposeless and your life is over and all of that. And the other is if you're 60, then you have to be ageless and you have to be 60 is the new 40. And why can't we be happy that 60 is 60 and 70 is 70 and realize that because we are living longer, we are redefining what 60 looks like, what 70 can be, what 80 can be. Can't we be happy and proud of our age and not try to hide it?
Yeah, we have the New Old Age column, which I write. We have a sort of an internal motto, which is we are not chirpy. Yeah. We don't write about 80-year-old skydivers, even though there are 80-year-old skydivers. But, that's not reality for most people. So I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it and avoid thinking about the losses and the adjustments that age brings. But that's not all there is to it. And it not only does it bother me these are the kinds of things that if you said this about any other group on the basis of gender or race or disability status, like people would be horrified. But ageism is sort of like the last acceptable prejudice.
Yeah. That's how I refer to it, as the last socially acceptable prejudice. And your comment about toddler, I hadn't realized it was that young, but it is. I loved Becca Levy's book, and I'm also reading a book by Tracy Gendron called Ageism Unmasked. And she talks about the fact that we are taught about ageism from a very early age. So changing this requires effort and intentionality on our part. But what do we have to lose?
Right.
And I think it's important to stop people in their tracks. And I really appreciate your point of view because aging, as we all know, is not for sissies. It brings its own set of challenges. But as you pointed out, so does any 20-year period. And if you drape this future in black crepe, then, of course it's going to be negative. It's a gift to still be here, in my opinion.
When we make these nervous jokes and these ageist comments, we're just harming our future selves, and we need to knock it off. I teach graduate students. They forget things all the time. They never call it a junior moment. They just say, I forgot. When we forget something, we feel like we have to apologize for it. It's just nonsense.
Are there aspects or are there examples of ageism that you see regularly that you would say to our listeners, watch out for this? Like if someone says, you look good for your age, those, what kinds of ageism would you recommend to our listeners to speak out on?
I think once your consciousness is raised about this, once you begin to realize like old is okay, you will see it, you will hear it, you'll recognize it. You'll see it in media, you'll see it in advertising, and you'll see it among friends. Like they will say things to you. Let me think of an example. Okay, I go to an exercise class. At the end, we do this sort of, we're lying on the floor doing this kind of guided imagery. And my teacher, whom I love and have known for years and years, there's some accordion music playing, and she says, imagine you're drifting down the Seine on a moonlit night, and you're 30, and it's a romantic night. And after this, I talked to her and said, Gina, you can have a romantic night on the Seine when you are 60 or 65 or 72. My personal motto is, young is not a compliment, old is not an insult. It's just where you happen to be in the life cycle.
I love that. Young is not a compliment, old is not an insult. Perfect. That's perfect. And you're exactly right. You can float down the Seine and have a romantic evening at any age.
Right.
If you're getting smarter, help us reach more minds. Leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends to follow us on social or subscribe to our newsletter at seniorityauthority.org. Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, which I think is really important, but some people struggle with it, and that is the finding of purpose. I think that for people who are older now, I think of in a very powerful way, my parents who are 89 and did not expect to live past 65. They're generally surprised to be here. And I think I see them struggle with finding purpose. And I think people that, were building their families in the 1950s and in a very traditional way, their purpose is a homemaker or a business person. And then that's done. Their kids are launched. The business is their careers is completed, and they find it hard to find purpose. And I don't know if that's a particular generational struggle or if more and more people who so identify with either being a mom or a homemaker or a business person, if that is something that many people face when it comes to the choice of stepping back and participating in retirement. Do you think a lot of people have a struggle finding a new purpose for this next 20 years, this next 8,000 days?
I think, I certainly worry about it personally. It's very individual. And in a way, I think it's both of the factors that you mentioned. It is partly the extended lifespan, the fact that this generation now that's approaching or entering retirement is better educated than our parents were or our grandparents, and probably has more options. Women have been in the workforce more. So, and they may have taken time off for family and then gone back. And so even if a husband in a couple is ready to retire after 40 years, she may not have had her 40 years yet to work and want to continue. Also, we have, as boomers, we were a big generation, but we had fewer children. Yes. And our children are having fewer children. So sociologists call these beanpole families. They last longer, but they're narrower. So we might be responding to some or all of these things. And the fact that we talk a lot about planning for retirement in a financial sense, but we don't talk a lot about planning for it in a emotional, psychic, spiritual, personal sense. So I have seen friends of mine struggle to figure out, what do I want to do now? What gives shape to my days? I personally want to keep working as long as I can because I like what I do and I'm pretty good at it. And I don't have something else I've been dying to do all these years. I haven't been waiting until finally I can paint or take photos, but I do know people like that too. So it's both generational and our cohort and how it's different and whether we can afford it because it is a privileged group that has these problems and many people just have to keep working and they cannot stop. So there's that. But also it's just very personal based on how we see ourselves and what we want to do. We do know, though, in a general way, that older people are pretty happy. They're pretty satisfied with life. And this is the work of Laura Carstensen at Stanford. It's called the U-shaped curve of happiness, and which shows over time and over many groups and across cultures and nationalities that young people are pretty happy. And then they kind of hit the bottom in their 50s when work and family are just the responsibilities they weigh you down. And then people get happier again in their 60s and 70s, which is in a way counterintuitive to those ageist beliefs that life is over and you're just waiting to die. People seem to be pretty happy. So it seems to indicate that people eventually figure it out. But I do think it can be a tough transition. And I'm personally not looking forward to it myself.
Well, I think you've hit on something that I feel very strongly about is when you say planning for retirement, people immediately go to financial. And of course, that's critical. You have to have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have to have food, shelter, and then you can get self-realization. But planning for retirement should also be, what do I want to spend this amount of time in? And I would love there to be more exposure to Laura Carstensen's U-shaped curve of happiness, because I think not enough people realize that. And it is when you are in your 30s and you're trying to build your career, trying to form your family, that is the lowest, which is counterintuitive to all of what society tells us. So that is very accurate.
It would be nice if this retirement was not quite so binary. Either you're working flat out and you hardly have time to take a shower, or you've got nothing to do. Isn't there some way of bridging this gap? And there's people talk about phased retirement. So you are in your job, but you're stepping down, you're doing less. Maybe you're cutting back on the number of hours or the number of days, or you're leaving, but you're consulting. Or you find a different thing to do altogether, but maybe you don't just work one day and stop the next. Maybe there's a sort of a glide path.
If there's ever a time in our country for a glide path, it's now, because of the impact of the beanpole families that you mentioned earlier. While our number of retirees is increasing 10,000 people a day, turning 65 in the U.S. for the next 18 years, we have this dwindling workforce where we have fewer people in the workforce just based on live births. We had a high in 1950 of 7 people in the workforce. 2011, it dropped to 4. 2030, it's 2. So we need people in the workforce. So this is the time for the glide retirement.
I agree. And I think to take a broader idea of what retirement is like would be beneficial both to the society and to us. I mean, every employer is tearing their hair out trying to find people. I don't necessarily think I have the skills to be a barista, but I could probably find something to do in my community that paid me if I wanted or needed that, or that didn't if I wanted or needed that. But I think it's realistic to say to ourselves as we're approaching this period, this is going to take me a year or two to figure this out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that people either stop and hit a wall and they don't know what to do, or they, as our society, our predilection is, they overschedule and they say, I'm going to join this board and volunteer here and do that. And you need time to think it through.
Right. Also, I think a lot of organizations are not particularly good at using volunteers. So these institutions might need to also think, what could we do with an infusion of people who are experienced, who are technologically pretty adept, don't need to be stuffing envelopes, who have talents to bring? How can we best use them?
This would be a great task force to create. I think you've got a fabulous idea. How has what you've learned about aging informing your own journey? We talked about the fact that you don't want to retire, that you have purpose and you have work and you're creating new content. I mean, your articles come out in the New York Times. They're so impressive. You have everyone important on speed dial. You have a valuable and rich relationship with your kids and your grandchild, or your daughter and your grandchild. How is what you're learning changing what you want moving forward?
Well, I do try to be conscious of the fact that for various reasons, this current balance I have is not going to hold forever. Eventually the Times will say, we don't really have a lot of 90-year-old columnists. Eventually Columbia University will say, they don't have to. I'm not tenured. They can just say, gee, Paula, we don't have a class for you this fall. Things will shift. And my granddaughter will grow older and she won't necessarily want Bubbe hanging around all the time. So I do have to think about this for myself too. But I am still working. I'm branching out into maybe different kinds of things. There's a little audio here now. I think I can probably do some freelancing. I do some mentoring with young journalists, which I think a lot of older people find meaningful. This is your contribution to the next generation, even if it's not in a formal way at a university. There are people that could use your experience and guidance. And I do exercise. I do that. It helps me be able to eat. I think it helps keep me stable. I've been going to this exercise class, this hour-long exercise class several times a week for 40 years. And it becomes a social connection as well as a physical outlet, because we know, especially through the pandemic, that people need social connection and that isolation is harmful to anybody, but especially to older people. So I go to this class, and the way I do it is it's just part of the morning routine. I don't have to make a decision about it. You get up, you have your coffee, you have your breakfast, you brush your teeth, you go exercise. That's just how the morning starts. Once it becomes a decision you have to make, do I go? Do I not go? This is the way people fall out of it. Just go.
It's a non-negotiable.
Yeah, just go. So that's the one thing that I do for myself, because if you don't just make it part of your routine, you will sit there and read the paper for an hour and a half, which is a perfectly good thing to do. But first, go work out, then you can read the paper.
No, I completely agree. Everyone that I've talked with, every scientist, every gerontologist, every physician, every researcher has said, exercise, you have to keep moving. You only have this one body that is the house that you're living in. And that's really important. It goes into that category of putting your oxygen mask on first. And exercising means you can do one of your most valued activities, which is helping to care for your granddaughter, which led to your most recent Audible book, which I would highly recommend. I listened to it with a friend on a car ride, and we were laughing and we were tearing up, and she was especially recognizing a lot of the wisdom that came across. So tell us a little bit about the Bubbe Diaries and what inspired you to write that, along with your Generation Grandparent column in the New York Times.
Well, Generation Grandparent was well established and it was kind of perking along. And then my daughter came out to see me. They live in Brooklyn. I live in New Jersey, so we can get back and forth on public transportation. Came out to see me and said she was pregnant. And I said, great. And I told her two things. I said, I want to be called Bubbe. This is Yiddish for grandmother. I want to be called Bubbe, and I will be your Friday daycare. I was far enough along in my career that I was no longer embarrassed to say to people, I'm sorry, I can't meet you on Friday. It's Bubbe Day, but how's Thursday? So that's what we did. And as I was doing this, what do writers do when something happens to you? You think, I could write something about that. So I asked an editor at the Times, not my editor, but a different editor. I sent her a a column even before my granddaughter was born and said, I would like you to consider this for a feature called Ties, Ties. But also I've noticed that the New York Times has a lot of material about parenting, but it does not have anything for grandparents, of whom there are only about 70 million in the United States. And what if we thought of this as the first in an occasional series of columns? The New Old Age runs every 2 weeks, like clockwork, and it's online and it's in the print paper. And I teach. I couldn't take on another regular column, but can I just send you things as I think of them? And she said, sure. So we started it. And about 4 to 6 times a year, I wrote a column for what we call Generation Grandparent. I always wanted to call it the Bubbe Diaries, but they said, people are not going to know what that means.
Oh, yes, they would. People are smart. They'll figure it out.
I thought so, but
Bubbe is in the lexicon of the country.
It's in the lexicon on the coasts. I don't know if in the middle people know, where they're not Jews, people don't know what Bubbe means, but we called it Generation Grandparent. But after I'd done a few years of these, a friend at Audible said, what are you working on? And I said, well, I've been writing these Bubbe columns. And he said, well, you could do that for us. And I said, I don't have any experience with audio. But when you're a freelance like me, your default is, if anyone says to you, hey, do you want to do something? You always have to say, sure. Absolutely. So I worked with them to turn these columns and a lot of new material into a 2.5-hour script. And then they approved the script, and I was waiting to hear, well, which polished voice actor is going to read this? Who do you think would be good? Had to be somebody that was old enough to be a Bubbe, and someone who vaguely sounded like they could be from New York or New Jersey, like you couldn't have a drawl.
Right.
Or be a Valley girl. So yeah. I was shocked when my editor said, well, we know your voice. And I had recorded an interim kind of thing for them called a scratch track. And they said, well, we listened to the scratch track and we think you should read this. So once again, I said, I don't have any experience with that. And they said, no, we'll give you a coach. We'll send you the equipment, because the studios were closed for COVID. So I recorded it in my bedroom with a bunch of equipment they sent me, and with a director in one ear and a sound engineer in the other. And we did it over 2 days, and it was just really interesting and fun. And people seem to like it, which is great. It's just funny that when you go to a bookstore, a suburban Barnes and Noble, even on Amazon, there are a million books about parenting. And there are really very few about grandparenting, which surprises me. It's a huge audience. I was just happy to have that chance to talk about my favorite topic, which is I call her Bartola. It's not her actual name. But one thing is, before I write anything, audio, columns, anything about her, I send it to my daughter and her husband, and they approve it because it's their kid.
Yeah. And although you have covered her identity very carefully, I think that's extremely respectful. And one of the things that I loved in the book is that you say, when you're a parent, you decide when you become a parent. When you're a grandparent, you don't decide. Someone else has decided, now you are a grandparent. And it's a good way to kick off a lot of what you were talking about, because the rules are not your rules anymore when you're a grandparent. It's someone else is calling the shots, and you have to have that balance between what you know and the wisdom that is hard won by being a parent, and the allowance of, this is your daughter and son-in-law's child, and they're going to make their own mistakes and lessons.
I think it's important when we become grandparents to understand that this is a different role in the family. And maybe one reason there aren't a lot of books about grandparenting is we don't feel like we need them, because we know, right? We did this once already. We know how to raise kids. That may be true, but we don't necessarily know how to be grandparents, because it's not the same. We're not the deciders. We, in some cases, don't even get a vote. And we have to negotiate a relationship which is both close and supportive, but does not take over. And I will tell you that while promoting this book, occasionally I would give a talk at a synagogue or a community group. And there were people, women particularly, who would talk about their mothers-in-law usually, and how much they tried to take over or tell them what to do, or they felt like they were being criticized all the time. And it had been 30 years or more since this happened, and they had not forgotten. So
wow.
I caution my fellow grandparents to tread lightly and to ask permission, ask before you send a puppy, ask before you give the kid a shotgun. This is a real example of a father who gave a grandson both a puppy and a shotgun, and without asking his parents. And neither of these gifts remained in his possession for very long. But it was an example of, you are not the parent, and you are the children, the adult children are the gateway to this kid.
Mm-hmm.
You want access to this kid, you have to respect the gatekeepers.
I think that's very true. And the aspect that I think is really makes this a deeper book than you might expect is not only is it your personal experience of being a grandparent, it combines your research, your knowledge, current studies and facts, and weaves them into and other people's stories. Like the one you just mentioned, you interviewed lots and lots of people for this book. So it's not just a personal reflection, although that's one of the parts I found most charming, but it's also saying, here's why grandparenting is different now.
Right.
And here's what you should think about as a grandparent.
Well, for example, this is not in the Bubbe Diaries because it was a column I wrote afterwards, but it never occurred to me to ask to be in the delivery room when my daughter was giving birth. My job was to stay home with the dog and walk the dog and feed the dog. And that was fine. I mean, this was a moment for her and her husband and their midwife, just as when I gave birth to her. I didn't have any parents in the room, but this is a thing now. There are obstetricians and gynecologists and hospitals have changed the rules, and birthing women can choose to have anybody in the room that they want, which often includes usually mothers, but also sometimes fathers or aunts and uncles or friends. So as a result of that, now sometimes I hear about grandparents being upset that they're not in the room, or the son's mother being upset that the daughter's mother will be there in the birthing room, but she won't be. So this was totally new to me, but it's just another one of those examples of where you don't necessarily expect an invitation. Like if you get one and you want to go, great. I also had grandparents say to me, "Are you serious? That's the last place." I didn't even want to be there when it was me. But
I think that's more the reaction of most people is I'd rather not have a play to a packed audience during my delivery.
Yeah, it's different strokes, but it's happening and it's allowed. And some people find it incredibly moving and important, and other people get ticked off because they're not included. And some people say, "I'll just wait out here in the hall. Thanks very much." But I had no idea. And I said to my daughter, like, "Did you ever think of this?" And she said, "Never." So we were just kind of out of it, I guess, but it's a thing.
Wow. Are there any suggestions that you would give to listeners now who are new grandparents or navigating the role of grandparents? Anything specific? I would recommend that they download your book on Audible, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes because it's just so full of great ideas and information. But what would you say now that you have had these years of expertise in grandparenting? What are the things to do or not do?
Well, I have found it personally very meaningful and rich. And I am, even though it does tire you out. Here's another reason to keep exercising. When was the last time you were chasing a 2-year-old around or lifting a 15-pound kid on and off, in and out of the stroller, up and down on the changing table? You got to get your upper body strength up there. I have found it to be wonderful. And I think also people might want to be prepared for this phenomenon called intensive grandparenting, which is that some grandparents, especially if they live far away, once there's not a pandemic, they'll just kind of swoop in for a few days and take the kids to the zoo or to an amusement park and buy them ice cream, and then they'll go home. And that's fine. That satisfies them, and it's fine with their children. But I will tell you that your adult children, if they're both working, or if you have a single parent who's your childcare responsibilities, they are struggling. This is a country that pays a lot of lip service to family, but it doesn't really support families very much. Childcare is extremely expensive if it's quality. Workplaces really are not adapted to family needs. It's just hard. And if you live near enough by that you can help on a regular basis, and you can make time for that in your life, I think your children will be so grateful. They will kiss the hem of your jeans. You will have a relationship with your grandchildren that you could not have otherwise. Or even if you don't live nearby, but you could take them for a week or come and stay in their house for a week so their parents can take a vacation. If you can be not only the fun grandparent, which is great, but you can help support this family in some way, I think it builds the bonds. And I think it helps young families who, God, this past 2 years, they were under such stress that I am not going to stop going on Fridays until they tell me, okay, you don't have to come anymore. Like maybe when she's 18, I'll stop going.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And it's very powerful. And the other thing that I noted in the book is you have a different relationship with Bartola because you have the gift of not just being there for the fun times, but you're also there for when she doesn't want to put on her shoes to go to the park and when she doesn't. So you're there, you're part of her life, and you show up when she's behaving well and you show up when she's not behaving well. And so she has another trusted presence in her life.
I think those two words, show up, are really crucial. You show up. And sometimes I get off the train. So it takes me 2 trains to get there and 2 trains to get back. It's about a 3-hour round trip. Especially when she was a toddler, I would come back and I would be so tired. You could find me at the local pizzeria just because that was the easiest thing. I'm not even going to look for leftovers in my fridge. Just give me a pizza and a Coke and then I'm going to crash. I mean, it's
10,000 yard stare,
It just, the last time I was chasing a 3-year-old around, I was 35. And this time I was 70. It's different. But, that she loves and trusts me, that she can come to my house and stay with me. And I have a little room with a bed for her. But what she wants is to sleep on the blow up bed. Because how much fun is that? Like the inflatable bed in my room. Okay. Now I said, you can sleep in the other room if you want. No, I think I'd like to be here with you, Bubbe. Okay. And that does mean that sometimes we have conversations at 2 a.m. Bubbe, do you think there might be a fox outside? I don't think so. Let's go back to sleep and we'll talk about foxes in the morning. To me, okay, when she goes home after an overnight, I am really tired. But I just feel like I am part of her life in a way that I just treasure so much. It's hard to explain if you haven't been there, but if you've been there, you probably know.
That's incredible. That's very powerful. Well, we are getting almost to the end of our time. We've learned so much about you, Paula, but I have an insatiable need to know more. So I'm going to ask you these lightning round 5 questions. What is your guilty pleasure?
Doing the spelling bee puzzle on the New York Times.
Wow, that sounds hard. Not like a guilty pleasure, but okay.
Well, it takes a lot of time, but not a lot of time, but it takes some time. And I probably should do something else, but I just do it. It's fun.
And I think we know your favorite healthy practice, but share what your healthy practice is.
I work out for an hour, usually 4 times a week, and I walk on other days to try to stay fit.
That's awesome. What is guaranteed to make you laugh?
My granddaughter, Bartola. She always has some interesting observation. My daughter asked her, what should we get Bubbe for Mother's Day? And she said, well, she's 5 now. She said, well, it's pretty boring, but I think we should probably get her books and black clothes.
Black clothes, a true New Yorker.
That was right on the money.
That is awesome. You're wearing black right now, for those of you who can't see. And Paula is surrounded by a wall of books. So very perceptive 5-year-old.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. It's hard. The next question is hard given your propensity for reading, and the book's right behind you. But what was the last book that you loved?
On the fiction side, I will read anything Ann Tyler writes, and the most recent one was called French Braid, and I loved it. But on the nonfiction side, I am a latecomer to this, but there's a New Yorker writer named Patrick Radden Keefe. And I started with his book on Northern Ireland, not really an interest of mine particularly, but I had seen the movie Belfast. And friends said to me, well, if you think that movie was so great, you should read this book of his called Say Nothing, about the Troubles. And afterwards, I read Empire of Pain, which is his massive work on the Sackler family and the opioid crisis. And what's interesting is that both of these books were just enormous works of reporting, hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of documents. But he is such a good writer that it has the immediacy and drama of a great movie. Empire of Pain.
He is one of my favorite nonfiction writers. I've read both Say Nothing and Empire of Pain, and then watched the Sackler drama on TV. I forget the name of it. And his book blows that away. He writes like a novelist. He's phenomenal. Okay, favorite escape. I think I know the answer to this one.
Yeah, you probably do. It's a little town far out on Cape Cod, and we're going there in a week and a half for our annual June vacation. We like June because, okay, it's a little cold, but then the Northern Atlantic never really gets very warm anyway. But it's pre-season, and there's just no crowds. And I rent a house, and I get 1 week to be by myself and relax and read and visit with friends from Boston. And then my daughter and son-in-law and Bartola come for 2 weeks, and then it's a whole different experience. But that's my escape, and we're going soon.
That is got to be something you look forward to.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Paula, thank you so much. This has been just a total delight to talk with you. I'm very honored that you agreed to be on our podcast. You know so much about this topic, and you've guided hundreds of people with your columns and now with your book. And I appreciate your work, and I hope you keep going for a very long time.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
That's our show for today. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends so we can reach more minds. Give us a rating and review on Apple Podcast, and send me your questions on aging. Until then, let's enjoy the chance to get smarter about growing older.